Okay, now let's take a look at the climate regions of Russia. Of course, we're going to eyeball our map key and or legend down there at the bottom right hand corner to kind of get a feel as to what these colors stand for. And the very first climate region we're going to take a look at is this one. Of course, that climate region is the humid continental climate region of Russia. This is the climate region where most of your Russians today live at. This climate area or this climate region is very similar to ours. It experiences 4 seasons year round. It can get harsh winters. It can get harsh summers. Overall, though, it's a very sustainable climate region. Yeah, at times their winters can actually be far more harsh than what we can experience here in Kentucky, but they do experience 4 seasons year round. Now, another climate region to take a look at is that particular climate region right there, the tundra climate region. Now, of course, the tundra, you should know what a tundra is. You're not going to find any vegetation up there. It is harshly cold year round. We're talking about mostly ice caps or just covered with snow. And of course, if you take a look at the map, you can see very, very quickly just how close it is to that Arctic, or no, I'm sorry, let me back up for a second. It is, in fact, within the Arctic Circle. Once you get within that Arctic Circle, you're going to find that most climate conditions, if not all climate conditions, are pretty harsh. And when I mean harsh, I mean really, really cold. Now, the next climate region we want to take a look at is that particular climate region right there. This is our subarctic climate region. This is the Siberia region and also the Kamchatka Peninsula region. You're going to find some harsh winters in this area. You can find a considerable amount of snowfall amounts, and what you will find as far as vegetation, as we're going to see in the next slide, is you'll find evergreen vegetation. You will not find deciduous vegetation whatsoever. Cool little animation there for you guys. Now, speaking of course, vegetation, let's take a look at this vegetation map. Once again, we have to look at our colors, kind of get an idea as what our colors stand for and what they mean. And with those in mind, let's take a look at some of these really important vegetation regions. First one, right there. The very first vegetation region we want to take a look at is the steppe vegetation region down there in the southwesternmost part of Russia. This is where you're going to find most of your crops in Russia. So in Russia, obviously, if it is to be a sustainable country, it has to have the ability to grow crops and feed its own people. In the steppe vegetation region, that's where you're going to find some hot, tall grassland vegetation. That is also the best region where you will find any sort of commercial farming type crops that can be grown there. Another vegetation region to take a look at is, of course, the boreal forest region that you see there. It takes up almost all of Russia. It is green. Now, what do we mean by boreal forestry? Well, that's another way of saying basically evergreen forestry. You're going to find lots of very tall evergreen forests that just riddle the landscape. Forestry is you can go miles and miles of Russia and see nothing but forests. So forestry is very important to Russia, and it could be a very profitable industry for Russia. However, because of the climate conditions in some parts of this region, it's just simply too cold to go out there and start cutting down some of these trees and using it for lumber and so on. So you'll see Russia use this region as a means of commercial lumber. However, you're not going to see it completely utilized because of its harsh climate conditions. Another vegetation region is, of course, your tundra, which pretty much means you're not going to find hardly any vegetation in this area. It's mostly ice caps or snow year-round. This is the area that's within the Arctic Circle, so good luck finding any sort of vegetation around here. And then we have the mountain tundra. And of course, the mountain tundra, what we mean by that is it is tundra conditions. However, due to the mountains, it's also highland conditions too. So you're going to get your snow caps at the very top. However, Once you get to the very bottom, you're still going to see ice caps. You're still going to see a considerable amount of snowfall. Because of that, vegetation is very little to none. Okay, now we have a population density map of Russia. Of course, using the map legend or key at the very bottom, we can tell that the darker the color it is, the denser the population is, meaning you got a lot of people crammed in a small area. The lighter the color, the less dense the population is, which means two things. Either the population is very much dispersed, and then also the population is generally fairly small. So now let's take a look at this map. Very easily, almost immediately, you can tell that most of the population lies right there. The western portions of Russia is where you're going to find most of the population, whereas on the eastern side, you're not going to find much population at all. Now, when we take a look at Russia, we say, gosh, Russia is a large country. It must have a ton of people because of the sheer size of Russia. But that's actually not true. Now we look at the top 3 countries in the world as far as population is concerned. China's number 1, India's number 2. We, the United States, are number 3. Now, Russia is the largest country in the world in terms of size, but because of the extreme harsh conditions off to the east, in areas particularly like Siberia, you're not going to find people living in that part of Russia. So instead, most people live in the more desirable locations of Russia where the climate conditions and the vegetation allows it to be easier to live in. And so most of the population of Russia really lives in only a third of what the entire country actually is. Also, one thing to really point out, I told you the Ural Mountains are a very, very important mountain range. You can almost draw a line just like this. That line, of course, is where you will find the Ural Mountains, but also that line is where you can really start to see not only climate and vegetation change, but beyond that line, that's where you're going to start to see really decreasing amounts of population. So on the left side of that line, you have increased population counts. On the right side of that line, decreased population counts. And remember, the Ural Mountains is what separates Asia and Europe. So if we had to ask ourselves this question, where do most Russians live at? Definitely that answer would be, hey, most Russians today live on the European side of Russia. One last thing, as far as Russia's interaction with the environment in the past several decades, in fact, it's been pretty poor. Throughout the entire 20th century, Russia made several steps to really industrialize the country, but not only industrialize it in just a very short time period. For instance, if you study Russian history, Joseph Stalin had a plan where in a matter of just a few amount of years, he envisioned Russia from becoming this sort of third world country to this industrialized superpower. Now, in order to do that, you can't really, in order to industrialize in such a short period of time, you can't really worry too much about the environment. You have to worry more about putting those factories in the landscape, making those factories run and functionable. And clearly that's what Russia was focused on. They weren't focused on the environment. So now looking at Russia today, Russia has really degraded their environment like many of the other countries that we've talked about too. You see there on the PowerPoint of the 84 Russian cities, of all the Russian cities, 84 of them have air pollution. It's actually 10 times the level that is considered to be safe. So Russia's pollution is pretty high. Is it as high as what you'll find in Beijing, China? Probably not, but it's still pretty high and still pretty awful as far as living conditions is concerned. Russia has improved in the past 10 to 15 years in developing green technology and reducing some of the pollution in the air that they've been putting up in the past decades. But they've just got so much work ahead of them. It's going to take them a long time to switch from that very industrialized image that they've had to a much more commercialized and service-based industry, which is what the United States right now is known for. And that is it, folks. So, do svidaniya, of course, which in Russian means goodbye. And I hope to see you on Friday. And I hope to get back to see a bunch of A's on those quizzes and their study guides filled out, because we will hit Russian culture next. Have a good weekend.